Hey, I'm Lee Waller, and welcome to Motion Media Design with After Effects. Today, I want to take a look at shape layers. All right, I'm going to start a new composition. Going to go with 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second, and for right now, I'm just going to do 10 seconds in that duration. I'm going to hit OK on that. So with the new composition, I'm going to jump up here to the rectangle tool, and that's how we're going to draw shapes. I'm going to click on this and hold, and you can see that we have a pop-out menu that shows us the different types of shapes that we can draw. We have the rectangle tool, rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, and star tool. With that tool selected, we now have a few options available to us up here in the tool palette. The first is fill, and the fill color, the stroke color, and then the stroke width. I'm going to go ahead and draw a rectangle so we can begin to play with those properties. For the fill, I'm going to click on that word there. You'll see that there are four options right here. The first one is none. So if you want no fill in your rectangle, you can select that one, and that will leave you with the stroke. You can also go with a solid color like we had. You can choose a linear gradient, or you can choose a radial gradient. Both of those gradients can be adjusted down here in the timeline, and we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. But we're going to go back to this solid on the fill. And once you've chosen what type of solid you want in there, you can hit OK. And then we have the color that we would want for that solid. You can click on that color swatch and then open up the color picker, choose a different color, hit OK. And just like the fill, the word stroke here will open up our options for the stroke that we want on our rectangle. You can go with no stroke. You can go with a solid, again, linear or radial gradient on the stroke. Once you've chosen that, you can hit OK. And then you can adjust the width of the stroke. Make it wider or more narrow. And we have our rectangle set. So those are the beginning properties of each shape. You can adjust them here, but some of them can also be adjusted in the timeline. So let's take a look at what we have created down in the timeline. We have a shape layer, and that shape layer will show us the contents of that shape layer. And right now it is this single rectangle. Under that rectangle, you will have the properties for that rectangle. There are four categories of properties under this rectangle. Now, for most layers that you drop in After Effects, you have just the 5 basic transform properties that you work with. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you might want to jump out of this tutorial and go take a look at some of my basic tutorials on animation and the 5 basic properties of layers. This shape layer does have those 5 basic transform properties, but I want to try to differentiate this. These set of transform properties are for the layer. They will affect the rectangle, but the rectangle also has its transform properties, the 5 basic ones plus a couple of more. So as we go through this, I'm going to try to help you understand the difference between these transform properties for this one rectangle and these transform properties for the entire layer. So let's start digging into this. First thing we want to take a look at is the rectangle path. I'm going to scroll that open, and you have the size, the position, and the roundness. Now I want to explain the path, so what I'm going to do is, right here, I'm going to increase the stroke. That'll just help us see this white background here, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. See this blue line here? That is the path for this rectangle. Each shape is going to have its own path, and you can manipulate that path. You can jump back out, and you can take a look at the size here. So I just drew this fairly quickly with no real idea as to the size, but if I want to dial this size in more accurately, I can click in these numbers and do that. What I might need to do though first is click off the constrained proportions, and now I can type in the separate numbers. So let's just do 500 and tab over to 500. And so now I have a perfectly square rectangle. So you can see there that I can change the size of this after I've drawn it. And if I want to constrain those proportions back, I click the link back on and I can size that up or size that down, and it will hold that proportion. All right, now this position is, again, the position of the path. And it is set at 0, 0, whereas the position of most objects that we drop into After Effects is based on the composition's resolution. So this is a 1920 by 1080 composition, so the center point would be 960 by 540 sitting right there, but we're seeing 0, 0. What that is showing us is that this position is based on this shape layer. The shape layer's position is based on, there it is, 960 by 540, the composition. So this shape is sitting on this layer, and if I adjust this position, it is again based on that shape layer. The roundness, rounds are corners, fairly simple there. So that's the path. Now we're going to take a look at some of the properties for the stroke. You'll see here that we do have the property for the color, and keep in mind, with that being down here in the timeline, the color of that stroke can be animated. So if you want it to change over time, you can do that. We have the opacity of the stroke, and then we can also adjust the width here down in the timeline, which again means that it can be animated. I will take a look in a later tutorial about the dashes, the miter limit, the line cap, and the line joint. So for right now, those are the basic properties for the stroke. Very similar to that will be the fill. You have the color there, you can change and animate, and then you also have the opacity of that fill that you can animate. The last set of properties, again, are the transform properties for the rectangle. Again, you have anchor point, and it's set at 0, 0, and then position. And so when we draw this solid in here and we want it dead center, you'll want to drop into these transform properties here and zero out these two numbers. Now that rectangle is sitting dead center of the composition on its shape layer. We have scale that we can scale this up and down with. And then we have a couple of extra properties that we can work with. The skew, so we can skew this, and then the skew axis, which can be animated and can create a very interesting animation there. I'm going to zero those two back out, get us back to where we are, and then we have rotation, and that will rotate that rectangle. And of course, we have opacity. So there's opacity in a couple of different places. Hopefully you'll notice that it's not just the fill or the stroke that we are decreasing or increasing the opacity of, but it is the entire shape and its stroke that we're increasing the opacity of there. I want to show you how this starts getting a little complicated. This is a shape layer, meaning that it's not restricted to just one shape. We can draw multiple shapes and they exist on this layer. We're not restricted to just one shape on this one layer. Instead of this time drawing a rectangle, I'm going to click on the ellipse tool and I'm going to come in here and draw an ellipse. Now, because I did not change anything up here, that ellipse is taking on the same properties as far as fill and stroke as the rectangle did. Hopefully you'll notice now down here in the timeline, under our contents, we have an ellipse now as well as our rectangle. Both of these sit on this shape layer. This is where the separate transform properties come into play. So now on this one shape layer, I have three sets of transform properties associated with it. One for the ellipse, one for the rectangle, and then one for the entire layer. If I go to the transform properties for the entire layer And I can demonstrate this easily by rotation. If I rotate this, you will see that it is affecting both of the objects and they are sitting on the layer. Now, it is not rotating the objects separately. They're both constrained together and being rotated in that manner. So those transform properties right there affect both of the objects. If I want to animate these two shapes separately, I will need to go into both of the shapes. There's my ellipse and their 4 transform properties. There's my rectangle and the 4 sets of transform properties for these. So I go into transform ellipse 1, and if I want to rotate that separately, I can rotate that separately. Same with the rectangle. If I want to move this in position separately, I need to go into the transform properties for that rectangle. So you can see that this can get a little complicated, and you have to kind of keep in mind which object you're working on and which set of transform properties you're working on. A lot of times what I will do, because this is very simple, I'm going to delete the ellipse tool. Rather than have multiple shapes on one shape layer, to kind of keep things divided up and easier to animate, I will draw a separate shape on a separate shape layer. So now you can see that I have 2 separate shapes and 2 separate shape layers. Some of the reasons you might want them together is if, yes, you know you're going to animate them and move them together, put them on the same shape layer. Also, if you're going to throw an effect on them and you want them to both have the same effect, it's easier to do it that way. For the same reason, you might want to separate them. If you want different effects on them, if they're both on the same shape layer, then you cannot separate that effect. You can also separate them if you need to, or join them if you need to. So let's say I did want both of these shapes on this shape layer. I can go here to this ellipse, I can copy it, then I can come down to my shape layer 1 and I can paste it, and it is there. Likewise, it works in reverse. If I decide that I don't want this ellipse on that shape layer, I can copy that, delete it, and let me get rid of this shape layer also. I can copy that ellipse, delete it from that shape layer, and then I can come up here to Layer, New, Shape Layer, and it's a blank shape layer. There's nothing on it at this point. You can see there's nothing on the contents, and I can paste that. So now it does have that ellipse on the new shape layer. So even if you kind of work yourself into a little bit of position that you realize you don't want to be in, you can kind of correct it. I hope you'll continue watching on as we get more in depth with motion media design with After Effects.